It is time for rows, columns, and elements. We're going to get inside the data frames and pull out the rows, columns, and the elements. Okay. First of all, how do we access data frame elements? Well, there are several ways to do this. By individual columns, note that columns are vertical. By individual rows, note that rows are horizontal. By individual elements, which are row-column combinations, and a smaller subset of the data frame, meaning multiple rows and multiple columns. Okay, let's start with columns by name, which is the most common way to access portions of a data frame. Okay, here's the classic iris data frame. Again, this is a historical data frame from Ronald Fisher in the 1930s. Pretty incredible that, he was, you could say, ahead of his time. Okay, most data sets that we'll be using will be from the last 20 years. Okay, and hopefully you guys can find some brand new awesome ones that are out there. Okay, so here's the syntax to access one of those columns. You use df, short for data frame, followed by brackets. I call this bracket notation. So we'll be using a lot of bracket notation to access elements of data frames. And then inside the brackets, you just put the name of the column. But these names are stored as strings, so it needs to be a string. For instance, df petal length, well, if you want to access that column, that's how you write it. You got to put df bracket with petal length in quotation marks. And there is the corresponding output. Now let's look at accessing rows. So rows are most commonly accessed by index. Now in this particular data set, which is actually common, the indices and the row names are in fact the same. But regardless, even if they were named something differently, some cases they do start with 1, you can access them by index in this anytime. So how do we do that? Well, df.iloc. iloc stands for index location. That's what you write using bracket notation. Then you simply put the index in brackets. So for instance, if we want to get the third row with index 2, you want to type in df.iloc2. Okay, go ahead and look at the data frame, verify what the output should be, and you should see something like this with a little extra stuff at the end there. Okay, but that is the correct row. Next, let's look at individual elements. This is where we need a row-column combination. So this is going to be used also using .iloc notation with the addition not just of the row, but also of the column. Pandas uses the linear algebra standard, which is row first, column second. So that's always the case, row, comma, column. Note that if column is omitted like it was previously, then that means all the columns. So this particular case, if we want to find the entry with row index 2 and column index 0, go ahead and look at the data frame, see what number you think that should be. Well, you should get an output of 4.7. Okay. And again, all you have to remember when using indices is that you start counting at 0. Now we can also use .iloc to access a full column. And this is actually somewhat standard too. How do we do that? Well, df.iloc again with index of row followed by index of column. Okay, this is interesting because there is a shorthand for all the rows and it uses the colon. Okay, so that colon means every row. You must have every row if you want the whole column, right? Because you're not excluding any. So in this case, then we're looking at the column with index number 2. Take a moment, look at the data frame, see what you think it should be. Here is the corresponding output. Recall it's the third one because we start with 0, 0, 1, 2. Now, you can also access them by name. And you will want to on occasion because you don't want to have to count the column indices. You may have a lot. And so it's slightly different in the sense of .ilog versus .lock. So .lock basically means you use the same style of notation, df.lock followed by brackets, but it's the row name, comma, column name. As mentioned here, the row names do match the indices. This is often, but not always the case. So if we want to get the entry that is in row index 0 and the sepal width column, look at the data frame, see what you think it should be. And hopefully you got 3.5, okay? First row, sepal width column. Now, how do you know what to use? Lock, iLock, some other weird thing. Number one, you'll get used to it, but here are a couple pointers to get you started. So single columns are usually accessed by name. That's how we view them. So you will quickly get used to this df.column name. So not dot, df bracket column name. Multiple rows and columns are usually accessed by index. So there you've got to remember that .ilock. For example, let's say we want to choose all rows and all columns except the last column. Okay, this is a tricky example. I'm putting it in here because it's actually relatively standard in machine learning. Okay, well, recall how to do all rows, right? When you want the colon. And then, like if you wanted all columns and you're going to stop at the 10th, you could use 0:10, or for shorthand, just :10. Okay, but do you recall how to get the last one? Well, there you go. It's df.ilock, all rows, comma. Let's take all columns, but end on the last one. That does not include the last one. You never include the last slice, the last index of a slice. This is, by the way, just like string slicing. And then for a final example, if you want to choose all rows and the last column, that'd be df.ilock, all rows and last column. Why am I throwing these out there? Because that last one, that's often what you want to predict in machine learning, and the previous one is what you're often going to use to train the machine learning models. We'll get practice, we'll get used to it, okay? Do what is convenient. You may even find additional ways to access elements. Pandas has a lot of options. There is usually no one right answer. It's simply a matter of kind of convenience and, I guess in some cases, a little bit of taste. Happy coding.